Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to uncover some of the hidden organizing principles at work in our mad, and sometimes very bellicose world. And this week, we're going to look at how war has changed and how war has stayed the same, and how war is a disordering force, but the absence of preparing for war can also be a disordering force. Throughout human history, there's always been disorder, and there's always been warfare. What has really changed? The technology used to fight it has evolved over time. The media mechanisms used to report on it have changed. The way in which propaganda produced around warfare, that's evolved. But in its essence, many of the most essential dynamics of warfare have remained unchanged. The defense retains its traditional advantages, just as it did when Carl von Clausewitz penned his famous On War. And when it comes to counterinsurgency, the challenge has been exactly what Mao Tze Dong wrote in his On Guerrilla Warfare, which is, how do you separate the local population from the warring insurgents? Given the protraction of the ongoing conflicts at present, I thought it would be useful if we stepped back a bit and we spoke to a true luminary in summarizing the breadth and scope of the history of warfare. I'm very excited and honored to be joined by my old mentor, Martin Van Creveld. I kid you not, Martin has written 33 books, and I've read more than 25 of them. He's arguably Israel's most famous military historian. He writes with such fluidity and grace on topics as wide-ranging as tank battles, feminism, human consciousness, philosophy, terrorism. Martin has not only inspired me over the years, he's briefed every major Western military. His books, Command in War, Supplying War, Logistics from Wallenstein to Patton, The Transformation of War, The Sword and the Olive, The Rise and Decline of the State, The Culture of War, Pussycats, The West and the Rest, have really changed how war is studied from Quantico to West Point to Sandhurst to Shrivenham to Sweden and even to the Arab world. So, Bruchim Habayim, Martin, and welcome to the Disorder Podcast.
To talk to you again, Jason.
Great. So I thought it would be nice to introduce the listeners to you for those who may not know you. You've always been interested in war, and you wanted to study it. You once told me that there are two kinds of military historians, former generals and would-be generals. Could you share with us how you came to this profession and how your own personal story has shaped how you view the subject?
Well, I came to Israel at the age of 4. I didn't know a word of Hebrew, and the very first Hebrew language song that I learned was Cheda Cheda, which was about how wonderful soldiers are and how women and girls should not be afraid of them. So the place was steeped in war and the military. I was part of this like anybody else, except that when the time came for the draft and the medical tests and so on, I was rejected, which meant that I was cut off from all my friends at once. In 24 hours, I no longer had friends left because everybody I knew was into the military. Instead, I went to study history in Jerusalem. And there I was the youngest guy in the class. I mean, at some part, I suppose I just decided I would avenge myself on the Israeli military, on the IDF, by showing that I knew more about it than they did.
And you've done that very effectively. For example, You have invented lots of different ways of thinking about war. I'm really interested in your imitative theory of war. You wrote something which always sticks with me. The enemy resembles us, therefore he needs to be approached not as an assembly of targets to be destroyed one by one, but as a living, intelligent entity capable of acting and reacting. Tell us more about this imitative theory of war.
For some reason, Clausewitz does not mention the fact that war is an imitative activity. By fighting your enemy, it's only a question of time. You're going to become like him, and he's going to become like you. I'll give you one example. The first thing that Hannibal did, arriving in Italy in 218 BC, was to make his troops put on a Roman armor. Putting on the Roman armor and Roman equipment necessarily meant that some minor tactics had to be adjusted in order to fit that armor and those tactics. So the longer the war, the more the two belligerents are going to resemble each other.
Yes, and this has profound implications for both Israel and Ukraine. How do you see this imitative process having played out, as it were, both in Gaza and in Ukraine?
To my mind, it's a great mistake to group Ukraine and the West Bank or Israel together. Ukraine is basically a conventional war. It is a war between states. It's a war between more or less regular armies. It's a war where both sides make use of very similar weapons, sometimes the same weapons. It's in many ways a typical conventional war between states, and in that sense it is a backward-looking war. Oh yes, the new technologies, but basically this war is much like World War I. Israel is very different. This is a war between a state and some kind of other organization or organizations that are not states. A war where no distinctions are drawn between the government, the military, and the civilians. Civilians, they're all mixed up with each other. A war that most of the heavy weapons are concentrated on one side only. So this particular war is much more that like the future, as I see it, than the war in Ukraine. Ukraine war is taking a look backward.
You've written a lot about the will to fight, and the will to fight is so essential. It's a very human impulse. It's a very masculine impulse. But why is this will to fight so lacking in Western Europe? In the States, it's partially lacking, but where do you see us being as we confront maybe new adversaries kinetically and non-kinetically in threats from China and Russia and cyber and things like this?
Look, if you are a Western European and the average age of the population is 45, you don't go to war like that. I've heard this once from a friend of mine who used to be the military advisor to Angela Merkel. And apparently they discussed this a lot. This was long before the Ukrainian war, okay? You cannot sell war to an older population. War is for the young, by the young, and of the young. It's only very recently, after many, many, many years of neglect, that some people in Europe are starting to wake up to this problem. Okay? We have a generation that for years and years and years and years, getting older and older and older, and on the other was educated to consider war as the worst possible thing in the world. I remember 1976, I visited Germany for the first time. I went with a friend of mine to a play. It was Aeschylus, The Persians. Okay? And at the end, they ended, and the call sounded in the hall, "Nie wieder Krieg," never again war. That has been the German slogan, quite understandably, after what happened to them during World War II. They have been saying this, shouting it from the rooftop for decades on that. Now, to throw the other back again and go back to a very different kind of system and education is very difficult. But the Germans will have to do it if they want to fight again. No question, Art.
This points out a very interesting ideological component of war. You need not only a young population, but you need an ideological or national matrix where people believe it is morally just and upstanding to want to fight. You've written that pacifism can be quite misguided on the left, but also that it misunderstands human nature. When you see all these protests throughout the West, do you think that their call for ceasefires or view that there can just be pacifism and all war can be abolished, is this very misguided?
Actually, you could turn it around. You could say that these people are anything but non-violent, anything but pacifists, as long as they are fighting, or what you call fighting, for what they see as their own cause. Right? So they fight, but unfortunately, perhaps unfortunately, their will to fight is not directed for the state in which they live. It's directed against the state in which they live. So it's not as if these people suddenly, unlike all previous generations, had become pacifist and nice people. It's just that the targets have changed.
Very interesting and controversial point, but something worth delving into.
Well, actually, with what I've written about the rise and decline of the state, and you could certainly make an argument, as I tried to, that it's not that war has changed, it's not that human nature has changed, it is that people are no longer prepared to fight on behalf of their states. They are prepared, however, to start to fight on the behalf of other organizations. Gaza is a very good example of that. They're not fighting on the behalf of a state. They're fighting on behalf of Hamas, on behalf of Islam, on behalf of I don't know how many organizations. That none of them yet, anyhow, none of them is a state. So this is certainly a way of looking at it. They're still as full of fight as they've always been, except that their targets have changed.
Is that going to be inherently disordering for us globally, that states were the ones who could marshal and coordinate people's willingness to fight? Although it could lead to massive bloodshed, it was an ordering component. The states ordered people's willingness to fight. And what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years is that non-state actors, terrorists, ideological movements here and there, white nationalist movements, for example, are things that people are willing to attach themselves to, and that can lead to a very disordered, chaotic release of violence.
I think it can do both. It used to be the case that states, until 60, 70 years ago, were able to mobilize millions of men and also a few women and make them fight each other. And they did so. Even you could argue willingly, even in some cases enthusiastically. Almost all states, I would say, have lost this ability. Okay? Now, there is talk, especially in Germany nowadays, about making conscription coming back. I don't think it's going to happen. I cannot imagine the young people, young Germans that I know, willingly putting on uniforms. So states have lost the mystique. They are seen as bureaucratic structures, which there are, which are often working against people, not for them, against your population, not for them.
The mystique of the Western state has largely faded, and that's why there's a rise of populism. The idea that the state in the US or Britain works only for the rich or only for the connected and is not fair, that leads to the desire for Trump or Brexit. And it also leads to a cynicism whereby people are not willing to participate not only in armed conflict, but in a whole range of national endeavors. So to pivot, deterrence has always been very important in war. I've become interested in the game theory aspects behind deterrence. And if we look at the conflicts both in Ukraine and Gaza, as well as with Iran, these conflicts that emerge clearly have happened because NATO or Israel was unable to deter their adversaries, and that political disorder internally projected weakness. Could you tell us, what is deterrence? How does it work?
Well, it works or should work by showing your strengths, by making sure that the other side understands that you have what it takes to fight, both in terms of personnel and in terms of readiness and in terms of weapons and so on and so on, that you are the stronger side and you can and will fight back. This is the pure deterrence. I remember once visiting the Minister of Defense of Singapore, of all places, and he told me that their problem was how to make the other side, meaning Malaysia, understand that even though the Singapore Air Force was becoming smaller, they would, through all kinds of tactical improvements, become stronger. So it's a question of being strong, showing your strengths. And that is basically as simple as in any child's game.
What about NATO's deterrence posture? I mean, NATO is the world's most powerful alliance in human history. But of course, there has been discord. Oh, who's spending 2% of GDP? Who isn't spending 2% of GDP? Will Trump back the commitments that the US had? Will Trump not back it? Where does all of that leave NATO's deterrence posture?
Well, the real problem with NATO, of course, is that there's no unity of command. There is no unified will. There is no unified European armed forces. Their ability to deter is very, very limited. And Putin's time is best to exploit it. Each time, basically, Macron or whoever it is, the Germans go to Paris, they're to Moscow, they're always humiliated. They're humiliated because everybody knows that basically they are impotent.
So the internal politics of Germany and France and how they relate to each other makes European deterrence on its own difficult to achieve. It's America which provides the deterrence capacity of NATO.
Then that's always been true. And conversely, of course, the Europeans have always doubted whether when the hour strikes, if it does, America will really sacrifice Washington and New York for, let us say, Hamburg and München. Will they? And however much the Americans were reassuring them. And of course, there are also limits to the reassurance they could give, because you don't want to give those Europeans a blank check. It was never enough, okay? The Europeans never quite believed the Americans, quite rightly so.
Yeah, because when push comes to shove, it might not make sense.
Never forget that the Russians got the largest, most highly developed nuclear arsenal of all.
So then do you think Biden's hesitancy in, for example, giving more ATACMS or howitzers early was reasonable because he was afraid of Putin's nuclear escalation, or those were always just bluff and bluster?
I'll quote Colin Powell in a different context. You never know what you can get away with until you try. But it's a dangerous game. May go right, wrong, so you're trying to be very, very cautious. On the other hand, if you are too cautious, then of course you are unable to deter anyone. That brings us back to the question of deterrence. It's how do you deter without, by trying to deter, provoking the very war that you want to avoid.
And after the break, Has war really changed over these last 30 years? And if so, how? Your two seminal works, The Transformation of War in 1991 and Rise and Decline of the State in 1999, without putting words in your mouth, how do you feel you anticipated changes in geopolitics that you've later seen come to pass?
My most important book is supposed to be A Transformation of War. And there I argued that what most people saw as small, unimportant wars in unimportant places were actually the wars of our time, and they were the future. Meaning the switch from war between states to war between other and against other organizations, meaning the switch from Trinitarian to non-Trinitarian war, meaning the switch, the obsolescence of many heavy weapons because they can't be used against terrorists, and so on and so on and so on. So this was my thesis.
So you anticipated the dominance of low-intensity conflicts. And I think you also warned about how low-intensity conflicts could sap the power of big states.
Yeah, but except that low intensity no longer is the right term to use, because these wars are extremely bloody. Even if you take the Ukrainian war, it cannot compare with some of those non-state wars, particularly in Africa, in Vietnam, and other places. Okay, these are not small, just small, out of the way, affect a few people with just primitive weapons. Not at all. These are huge conflicts based on mostly on pure hatred, much more so than many interstate conflicts.
That's true. All you need to do is turn on your television screen to see the extent of the destruction and implications. So should we use the term asymmetric war instead?
Maybe so. Actually, I've tried many times to find the correct term, but never succeeded, at least not for long, because reality is so dynamic. It changes all the time, and their old terms often do not fit. It used to be bushfire war, it used to be colonial war, it used to be many things, but many of those terms are out of date almost before they're coming to use.
So I think that you anticipated some of the threats of these asymmetric conflicts to sap not just America's strength, but the West in general. When you look back, how have mistaken strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan placed the West in a weaker position to confront current challenges from China, Russia, terrorism, non-state cyber actors? How do you see the connections there?
The West has, I said United States, but the West and its allies have suffered or gone from one defeat after another, and surely that is something that does not help your will to fight. Okay? You go from one defeat to the other. It's even worse than that, because defeated parties are so weak. So victory itself is demoralizing. This is the other great, I think, insight of transformation of war. By fighting the weak, because war is an imitative activity, fighting the weak makes you weak. So the real art is don't get involved into such a situation. This is exactly what is happening with Hamas right now. We're playing against a very weak opponent in some ways. Okay? They're weaker in almost every aspect except the will to fight and die. The real heroes in this struggle. Every day you read the Israeli media, every day brings up its crop of Israeli heroes, soldiers. This is ridiculous. The real heroes, the only real heroes in this conflict are the Hamas and the Palestinians, okay? Because they take it. They are killed in numbers. But there's no question who is suffering more, who is dying more. And yet they keep fighting. Some of them do so, yes, because the Hamas has a very tight grip on them. But basically, there are also limits to that. Okay? Israel is becoming weaker with every single hour passing, and the other side is becoming stronger. And this is what happens when the strong fights the weak for time after time after time after time.
And I have to say, when I heard you speak, Martin, I remembered the unique capacity that you have to bring me close to tears, because obviously what's happening in the Middle East is the very definition of human tragedy. I cry and my heart bleeds for both sides. I 100% can empathize with the tragedy on both sides of this conflict. And the idea that the only virtues that are being cultivated is the ability to choose to die, that really moves me, the tragedy of it.
Me too. The tragedy of both sides. Ultimately, it would be hard to say which tragedy is greater. You can't count them. You don't appreciate tragedies just by counting doses.
100%, because the way in which the Israeli spirit and sense of security has been bruised is something which cannot be defined by numbers. And I think on the Palestinian side, the sense of futility and just all-consuming, shall we say, horror, again, is completely different than the body count. The body count is the least of the worries when it comes to the spiritual side. It's very difficult to pivot away from such a depressing topic. Allow me to entirely change the discussion. If we go back to your rise and decline of the state, could you say that the Western state has declined, but the Eastern state may have very much risen in the last 20 or 30 years, because it's not only that economically the miracle in many East Asian countries, but also the willingness to identify with the nationalism and potentially to fight, that China is a place which is very energized and its state structures are not weakened by toying with capitalism, they're actually strengthened.
Well, this is the greatest military, political, economic development of, let us say, the years since 1979. The rise of the Far East in every possible way. And it looks as if it is just starting.
Very good point. And if we take a longer durée historical perspective, it was bound to happen, because throughout most of human history, the subcontinent of India and the Far East was where half the world's population lived and nearly half of its economic activity. So that the period 1600 to 1950 was quite abnormal. In other words, that it had 10% of the world's economic activity. So the Far East and the subcontinent had to come back, given their role in human history, right?
I have a friend who's a Japanese expert, Benami Shiloni. He once told me, look, this is the way the world has always worked. The first most civilized places was the Middle East. Then it went to Europe, then it went to United States, America, and then it left the Pacific, and now it's come back to the East. Okay? Meaning, of course, a different East. The world is revolving, it's not stationary, and each region or each part of the globe, in turn, I suppose, is assuming the leadership. At the moment, clearly it is the Far East. Luckily, they're not one big state, there are two, India and China. So there's always a possibility of playing them off against each other.
I want to draw from your experience and expertise as we order the disorder. What's one lesson you've extracted from your writing and researching that you'd like to share with listeners who are concerned about the terrible state of global affairs today? What's one thing that might give them hope to think differently about how the world looks?
Look, I'm not sure the world was less disordered at the time of Vietnam. At the time of World War II, at the time of World War I, the world has always been a disorderly and dangerous place. And the only advice I can really give is keep your powder dry and your facing good and your powder dry. Or in the Roman saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. Don't take the example of the European Union, which for decades decided that war was passé, there would be no longer be war, maybe some all kinds of unimportant place in Africa, and so on and so on. But this turned out to be the wrong piece of advice, and it's always the wrong piece of advice.
Yeah, lacking deterrence invites war. Very good advice. If you could give one suggestion to the Palestinian leadership and one to the Israeli leadership about how they could make the world a better place, what would it be?
Maybe what Gandhi is supposed to have done when allegedly a Hindu asked him what he should do with a Muslim kid whose parents were died. And his answer was, raise him as a Muslim. And the other way around. So both sides should learn how to understand each other. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work. So keep your facing good and your outward fire.
Well, that's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, you can tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every episode launches. And for more on today's episodes and links to many of Martin's books and interesting quotes and articles, please subscribe to our Substack. It's free. You can find the link in the show notes, but if you want to pay for the upgraded premium version, nobody's stopping you. As always, our producer is George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. Thanks for listening and have an orderly week.